Welcome to the Fangled Cast, brought to you by Fangled Technologies, where we help you convert every person your company touches into a voracious advocate for your brand. Welcome back to the Fangled Cast. Today is going to be a super interesting conversation with a friend of mine I've known for, too many years. His name is Mike Hvisdos, and he's from the company Inquizo. And Mike is a specialist in curiosity. What does curiosity mean? We're going to talk about today. How does it affect the workplace? And how do we get our employees to be even more curious to get more productivity in a better environment to work? So Mike, if you want to, or do you go by Michael these days? What do you
Michael's better. Yeah, Michael's better. So
great, Michael.
Most of the people know me by Michael, but I don't care.
Yeah, that's good. Tell us a little bit about yourself and Inquizo.
Well, I mean, Inquizo's been around for probably 10 years now, and it really just started by happenstance. The position I was in before starting the firm was Chief Growth Officer for a privately held company, about $1 billion in turnover. And I left that organization seeking other opportunities. And when I did, I reached out to a variety of different types of companies and through my network. And people asked me to give them a hand with something in their business. They didn't have that senior level position open, but they needed a different perspective and different expertise. So before I knew it, I had 4 or 5 of those agreements and stood up a consulting practice outside of that, mostly helping people on the growth side of their business, customer experience, commercial strategy, those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And the more we dug into businesses with people, the more we saw them struggling to really create the right environment, if you will, inside those organizations to allow that growth to take place. And that sort of led us down the path of curiosity.
It's interesting. You know, when people ask me when I'm looking for ideal folks in any aspect, what are some of the key characteristics? I always say I'm looking for people who are curious, who are creative, who are tenacious. And I'm curious myself at almost everything. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm probably, if there was a scale, I'm at the top. I'm always trying to learn something new. How do you define in the workplace? What do you mean when you say curiosity?
Yeah, it's a hard definition to put in place, but to me, it's the hunger to want to know more. And that's really what we're looking at. Like if you go to Google's past CEO, there was an interview done about 4 years ago before he moved on, and they asked him, like, what do you look for in an employee today? And he said, 2 things. One is tenacity and the other is curiosity. They're big believers in failing fast but taking that and learning from it as well. So the tenacity part is desire to keep moving forward based on what they're learning. Yep. He said, but curiosity is fundamental to everything.
So how do you tell if somebody is or isn't curious?
Yeah, for a long time we weren't able to tell, and a lot of people actually lumped curiosity into IQ, and they thought it was a natural thing that people either had or they didn't have. It is a good predictor of intelligence in young people, but it's a totally different thing. In fact, most organizations measure IQ and EQ today, but they're actually not paying attention to curiosity, or what we call CQ, the curiosity quotient. So it's around desire, and until about 2 years ago, there really wasn't a good measure for curiosity. Most of the studies were done around health and well-being, but nothing was being done in business around adult professionals and their ability to be curious. So we actually set out on a journey to understand it better. And by understanding it better, we then took a step back and said, hey, is this actually measurable? And my business partner has got a background in experiential design. And as we started to talk about is curiosity something we can measure in an adult professional, she said, well, the thing we have to guard against are what everybody witnesses in those IQ, EQ tests, and that's people gaming the system. So we've used those tests enough now that we are able to predict what people want to hear. And we didn't want to create a measurement mechanism that allowed people to game it, if you will. So she suggested that we actually approach it through natural language. And long story short is there's a language of curiosity, and we can measure people's language now and actually tell them what their curiosity level is.
That's fascinating. Tell me what does a business, or give me an idea of the contrast between a business where you've got most of your employees lacking curiosity and businesses where the employees are always curious?
There's tons of things that
Sure.
happen to a business when they're not curious, and I think one of those is actually the engagement of their people, and the other is the productivity that they get out of their people as well, and those are dramatically lacking. But the other thing is they don't realize their full potential, and that's what organizations don't realize is they don't really know what they're capable of because they're not paying attention to the right things. So if you go out and interview CEOs today, here's what they'll tell you. The single most important thing we have to get right is we have to innovate, okay? And I would agree with them, right? If you don't innovate, you get passed by.
Sure.
But what they don't pay attention to, Andrew, is the equation that gets them to innovation. So there's a very simple equation that nobody's paying attention to today, and it's this. I can't innovate unless I'm creative, and I can't be creative unless I'm curious. And in fact, everything we're doing in business today is actually squashing the curiosity of people. It's the process rigor and all of that we've put into business to squeeze more out of them. We're not creating the right environment for people to be curious today.
That's really interesting. When for me, being more on the creative side of the business and the marketing team and the sales team, one of the key principal parts of my company is really understanding or helping our customers understand who the heck is your customer or customers, and getting very curious about understanding their challenges. So in that frame, I think most people understand the power of it. Can we take the concept of curiosity, let's say, to the number crunching department, the accounting department, and why the curiosity is important for them?
Yeah, we actually take it throughout the organization,
Right.
and it's really environmental more than anything. When we create the right environments to allow curiosity to grow and nourish, then we get a different end result. So it doesn't matter what department you take it to, it's applicable across all of business. Now here's the sad part of it. If you interview employees, there was a study done about 3 years ago, and they interviewed employees and said, are you able to be curious at work? And only 22% of the population said we're allowed to be curious at
Isn't
work.
that crazy?
So that's the disconnect, right? I want to innovate, but I'm not willing to create an environment to allow it to actually start. And that's the thing that's disappointing.
When you talk about that curious language, just to kind of understand a little bit better. So when we talk to a guy, say in the IT department, can we do this? And their response is no, or their response, which would show curiosity, is, wow, that's an interesting idea. Let me go investigate and find out. What are some of the other kinds of things that would let you know that a person's curiosity factor is in a realm that can help with the business?
Yeah, it's really how they dig in, right? They don't take the superficial for granted, but they dig in with a different level of trying to understand. So when you look at the language of curiosity, the vocabulary that we found behind it has more to do with how people actually explore, they dig into to something there. And when we see that, right, then we know the curiosity level is in a different place. So there's a whole vocabulary language that's behind this. And the really fascinating thing is this. There's no differences between age or gender or region around the world. The language vocabulary is the same. Now, how you interpret it and translate it is important, okay, to make sure you get the same thing. So in all the measurement that we've done so far, the only difference we see is this. There's a language of curiosity for primary educated people, and there's a language of curiosity for secondary educated or college and above people. But what fascinates me about that is, the older we get, the more apprehensive a lot of us get to these surveys where they're asking, like, what is your age range, right? Or what gender are you, whatever it may be. And everybody back saying, what are they going to do next? That is actually them not being curious, by the way. But we don't have to actually do that anymore, right? Because we're paying attention to how they're answering. Now, we do that through a series of questions and written prompts, but we've also done that by going in and harvesting, say, somebody's email database. And what we're looking for more than anything are words and word phrases that are there. So we're not really looking at confidential stuff. We're analyzing how they communicate even with their customers or clients. And that can tell us how curious they are. Yeah.
That's really, really interesting. Can you share maybe some case ideas? Obviously, there's confidentiality involved of engagements where you've been dealing with companies that lacked in curiosity, and how you were able to to increase it within the organization and what the actual results were?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people, when we started to measure this, they default to like, am I good or am I bad? So do we have a scale? Yeah, we do have a scale, but we pay less attention to the scale that's there. What we're really looking for is difference. So let's take just a company and a general population. If I've got a curve that's fairly spread out, right? The question I'm asking is this: the people at the high end of the curiosity spectrum are doing something different than the people at the low end of the spectrum. And what we want to do is to pay attention to what they're doing to create the same kinds of environments that raise curiosity in that organization. Now, we'll also benchmark that against some of the best organizations that we've worked with as well. So the whole idea is to shift them up the scale to the right, if you will, but also to get a lot of compression in their curve as well. And when they do, we see a big jump in performance and results. So the other part of this story is this: once we figured out we can measure it, we said, how important is it to performance? So we started to measure performance and curiosity together in organizations. And what we found is there's a direct link between these two items. So every time I impact curiosity, and that's the leading indicator, and it moves upward, then the performance always follows it. And that's what we see in the organization. So the sales results, right, the ability to reach their customers, the loyalty that they're generating always goes up when the curiosity level goes up as well. So that's fun to see. One of the organizations that we've been working with for a long time, we were actually working on curiosity with them for about 5 years before they got to a point where we could actually measure them. And the reason for that, they were going through all kinds of acquisitions and things like that. So they finally agreed to get measured. Now, obviously, we were holding our breath, right? Because we're like, oh, where are they going to fall on the scale? Yeah. But it was textbook, right? I mean, we measured them and they were so far to the right and so compressed, right? It was that dramatic. Now, over that course of that 5 years, we've seen dramatic increases in their sales as a result of curiosity. But a really fun story that I'll share with the audience is this.
Sure.
I was at the kickoff for their global leaders, 144 people. And I was there to continue to talk about curiosity. And the head of their commercial organization gave them their sales target for the year. And the number was like 600 million per quarter, okay? So I was sitting in the back and I'm listening to this and watching the audience. And I lean over to one of his counterparts and I asked him a simple question. And that question was, why 600 million? And he looked at me really funny, right? And I asked him, I said, no, I'm serious, why 600 million? And he goes, well, that's the number. You know, the market's growing at 10% or whatever it is, right? And he tried to map it out to me. And I stopped him again. I said, why 600 million? And he asked me, he said, Michael, what are you getting at? And I said, I believe we're self-limiting, okay? So I got up to address the group right after this all happened. And I started the same way with the entire population of people. I said, why 600 million? And they all looked at me, right? And you heard some stirring around and they said, well, don't raise our target, Michael, right? Yeah. And I said, hey, look, I said, here's the reason I raised the question to you is I believe you're self-limiting. And I think we all do that to a certain extent. So what we talked about from that point forward is this: if we really believe curiosity is the key to unlocking our potential, then if we build the right environments, just like we started in the organization, that we'll actually start to see our full potential. And here's what happened. 600 was blown out of the water. They did 780 per quarter.
It's amazing.
Profitability.
Amazing.
So there is a direct tie there, right? And that's what people aren't paying attention to today.
Mm-hmm. As a leader who's, for example, leading a sales team or otherwise, do you feel that asking questions that lead to curiosity are more powerful in terms of the coaching method? For example, what could you do if you hit your goal this year? Not let's hit your goal, or where would you be? Well, the questions that seem to elicit people having to use their imagination and get curious about what would happen if they succeed to get rid of those limits that we're talking about.
I'm pretty fortunate. One of the things we do as an organization is work with leaders, and we coach and develop them.
Sure.
And when you really strip away, what coaching is all about, it is about being curious, right?
Yeah.
It's about asking the questions to get people to self-realize, like, ooh, maybe I should approach it that way. And then even then, as a leader, I lean in and say, okay, well, what would that look like? And how would you get that done? What are the things that we need to develop to get you there as well? See, when we own it ourselves, we get further faster. So I would say, leaders have to use questions, not to tell people what to do, right? If they tell people what to do, they own the problem versus the person that actually is having that difficulty.
Yeah, I was having sort of a philosophical conversation with a client not long ago about how, when you're in a super competitive market where you truly do perform and have a higher value prop, how do you build a marketing campaign to get your customers curious enough to do the research so that they can recognize on their own that they've discovered the difference, and how getting your customers curious is just as important as it is within the organization. I'm curious if you've done any work in that realm.
Yeah, we have, and a lot of it's about cutting through the things that they can learn on their own. So, we live in this age of information, and, we're even starting to get more and more data, and we're harvesting it with AI and all of these kinds of things. So there's a lot that I can actually do on my own. The bigger question for me in a business is, what don't I know?
Yeah.
Or what are other people doing that I'm not paying attention to? So, insights, and we overuse the word insight because, we put data behind something, we call it insight. It's just information.
Yeah.
Insight is like, what is the implication on me? But when I'm thought-provoking and disruptive in my marketing practices, I get people to think more, right? And that's encouraging the curiosity. If I have a desire to want to learn more, my desire to click and go deeper, even on your website, goes up dramatically as well. So, we've all hit those websites and we're a little curious, and you click one button and you get the whole questionnaire to fill out, like, who are you and everything else. It's like, we've got to learn to put that on hold and earn that, right? And when I give people some things to pay attention to, and I keep educating them and leaning them in, then at a certain point in time, they're more willing even to say, call me, right? Let's have a conversation. So we need to use it in our marketing practices.
It's interesting. I had a similar conversation on another recording with two guys that are consultants, one of them a psychologist and the other in the HR world, about the Dunning-Kruger effect in the workplace and how it affects the millennials. And for people who don't know what that is, it's research that was done to understand how it is that people believe that they're experts before they're experts, and basically they know this much and they think there's only this much more to know, so they're experts because they don't know what they don't know. And I'm wondering, as we're talking here, it just sort of occurred to me that really what needs to happen to get someone to start to look at knowing what they don't know is to inspire that curiosity. I'm curious if you wanted to give advice to someone today who's just hired a bunch of self-proclaimed experts who, second week on the job, they want to know why they're not a VP. What could you use these curiosity concepts to help break that bubble so that they start to recognize how much more there is to know before they're ready for that?
Yeah, it's a really complex question.
Absolutely.
Right? But I think the key thing is this. It's getting them hungry to learn more. A lot of the younger generation wants to be given the blueprint to go execute. Mm-hmm. They want to be as efficient as they can. And that doesn't increase their curiosity level. So even when you look at curiosity, a lot of people are like, that means they're willing to go out and search for something, Google something, right? That is not what we're talking about at all. The Google effect, the instant gratification part, doesn't build your desire to be curious. It's what we call diversive curiosity. So instant gratification gives you the surface level, but epistemic curiosity takes effort. Okay, and that's really us nurturing the curiosity muscle. So think of it this way.
One sec. So from the Google part of it, as I'm listening to what you're saying, it seems to me that the folks that think of Google as a source of the answers. I would think it's the opposite of curiosity, not just because it's kind of like, well, why would I dig in and learn these things when I could just find out when I need it? I don't need it yet, so I'm not going to find out. Is it?
Yeah, that's exactly what's going on, right? That's
Yeah,
so
it's
that's
fascinating.
the quick and easy part, and that's why it's not the curiosity we're talking about. What we're
Hmm.
talking about is the desire in them to dig deeper. So
Hmm.
let's say I get my answer in Google, right? If I start thinking like, oh, that's interesting. Why did that happen? How did it occur? What was the timing in it, right? That takes effort now for me to find out. And
Hmm.
as soon as I apply effort, I start to nurture that muscle, right? And that muscle feeds off itself. And now the more I do that, the more I naturally look for those things. That's the hunger side of it, right? That's epistemic curiosity. And that is something that is nurtured over time, but it requires the right environment to help it grow as well.
Yeah, I had a funny conversation. I know you're originally from Cleveland also, and you know how Lake Erie is. You can go out on Lake
Yeah.
Erie, and it's absolutely glass. It's beautiful, and if you blink your eyes, there's 8 foot waves. So a friend of mine's kid wanted to learn how to sail, and the father agreed to pay for sailing lessons if he would take these lessons. And the kid said, "I can figure it out. I can watch YouTube videos and figure it out." And his father said, "That's fine. If you think that you can Google when it goes from 0 to 8 foot waves to get the answer of how to deal with that, that's good. But let me know because we'll increase the life insurance." And and they put the kid on a boat and told him he couldn't take his phone. And sure enough, there was a storm coming in, and he went from the basics of sailing to how not to fall off a boat in high waves. Uh,
Yeah.
it's kind of a brute way of teaching curiosity, but I guarantee he wasn't thinking YouTube was his answer anymore.
Well, but just your analogy, right? Growing up in Cleveland, I was very fortunate that my dad had a boat, was a fisherman, and it was more of a ski kind of boat too. So
Sure.
that's what I did. But one of the things he taught me very early on is that Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes.
Yep.
And when storms come up, they come up fast and hard because of that.
Yep.
So he taught me to respect the lake and the surroundings that were there, right? So without that, I wouldn't have paid attention.
Sure.
So again, that takes us sort of back to being curious again, right? You got to understand what is going on and why, not just think you can get to the quick answer.
Yeah, that's important stuff. I'm so glad we had an opportunity to talk about this because I can see so many different places within our work lives and our personal lives where curiosity. I'm the type of guy, I don't vacation in the same place twice because I'm curious to know somewhere else.
Sure.
You knew me when I was still in my teens, and I was going to explore the world. Every place I would pull up the map and look and go, God, I wonder what life is like there. And then you talk to
Yeah.
people who never been out of the county. This is where I live. This is what I do. Why would I want to go anywhere else? And I always wonder how those people can ever be inspired to be curious enough to want, or is it my judgment that thinks that they should be?
Well, I mean, maybe they're just curious about different things,
Yeah.
right? Maybe they're curious about like the hobby they have, or maybe they're an engineer that doesn't like to travel, but
Yeah.
they love their craft, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe they're a designer that is writing books like crazy about design. I mean, so I think people experience it differently, but I think the common thread is this: I have a desire, right, to dig
Mhm.
in. And when you put that personal desire in a workplace that doesn't allow it to grow, then it gets shut off really quickly.
Yeah.
So we will do it for a while, but the more we are prevented from doing it, then we start to lose the desire to do it as well.
So there's a factor that people who begin to be curious about things but get no reward for it sort of fall back in the fold of not being curious.
Yeah, they will. They'll fall back in the fold, or they'll leave, right? Because they're not able to, and it's creating enough tension within them that's like, I got to get to a place where I can express myself. But this happens through little things, right? Squeeze efficiency, I lose effectiveness.
Hmm.
Over process for efficiency, I crush effectiveness, right? As a leader leading a small team, it's as much of this: do you create enough space in your meetings for people to dig in with you and ask all the questions?
Hmm.
Or do you have that person that always asks questions, that you immediately shut down because Tom or Mary is always going to ask the same questions and we're tired of hearing it. Or it's as simple as this. As a leader, if I hear that, do I give it one of these looks?
Yeah.
So I just rolled my eyes for those that are on audio, right? If I roll my eyes, I'm sending a message to that person saying it's not important. So the more I do that, the more that person, loses the desire to want to lean in. And as leaders, we have to do just the opposite.
Many, many times, because what my career is based on doing creative and different approaches to things. And it's always soul crushing when there's one person in the room who isn't willing to wait to the end to understand the whys behind a change. And it's also tricky as the curious person who's trying to bring those things up in the meeting to not alienate people by being the weird guy in the room who's out in left field, when really, a lot of times, and one of the things that I've noticed, how I measure somebody's ability to be curious or creative, is when you're using a metaphor for something that is related or parallel to get to a response. I just recently had engagement with people. Nobody wants to hear those stories, and those stories are directly related to where the marketing strategy is going. And you don't want to say it out loud, but I'm sorry that you're not creative enough to understand what we're talking about. What worked in, for example, the steel drum industry, and the concepts behind it in terms of understanding the customer interface and all this kind of stuff that we did is definitely parallel to what could work in a different industrial or even in a consumer product space. And you come across folks that it just, if I'm in the the bus business and you're not talking about the bus industry, shut up, because we sell buses, we don't sell that. It's fascinating.
The reason for that, though, is because we train people to talk about the stuff that they do and the things that they sell, right? And that's where a lot of organizations get this wrong, right? They want everybody to be so schooled in what they do that the approach that they take is to go do exactly that, talk about themselves. What they don't pay attention to are the business challenges and outcomes that people are faced with or that are important to them. And if I get up there and I'm curious about those things, now my conversation is scalable. My knowledge is scalable as well. So I can take something out of steel drum and go to the bus industry because the business issue is the same or similar.
Yes.
Right. I can go take something out of tech and walk it over to healthcare. Right. So it doesn't matter where you come. We experience a lot of similar business issues, and that's what we have to pay attention to. Yep. The hospitality industry started to go down this path more a few years ago because they realized, right, like we aren't learning from ourselves anymore. We have to look outside of ourselves and really start to pay attention to other businesses. So you see good companies do that all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a fellow that I worked with when I was in the plastic strapping industry, and he had enough. He wanted to leave the company. He didn't like the company he was working for, and he had left. I had left maybe 3 months before to pursue something else, and he reached out to me and he said, "Could you help me with my resume?" I said, "Sure." And he sent me the resume and his job description, who he was at the top. He had his name, and it was plastic strapping sales professional. And I said, why are you so limiting? He goes, "That's what I know how to do." I said, "Aren't you curious what else you could be doing with the same background? Are you in plastic strapping, or do you want to stick in the packaging field? I'm an industrial packaging salesman. Or am I a B2B salesman or salesman? Which one limits you?" And immediately you could just see the cogs turning in his head.
Yeah.
He wasn't curious enough to even think beyond how he had been indoctrinated into this role where he was doing the same thing for, I think it was 13 years. So it's a good example of a lack of curiosity and vision, and how it's so self-limiting.
And I get that question quite often, even in our practice, like, what industry do you focus on? And it's really all of them. It's not industry specific. So while we see a lot of interest and curiosity on the tech side and on the pharma healthcare side and even in manufacturing, consumer packaged goods and those kinds of things, we've been in all the industries.
Sure.
And working with organizations that are family-owned businesses all the way up to Fortune 50 as well.
Yeah.
I think the bigger thing is our organizations willing to set aside what has gotten them to where they are and start to learn to be different, because we live in a different business world today. It's so complex, it moves so quickly, right? That if we're not curious about these things, it's hard to keep up with those things.
Yeah, I think any business that's not curious about how they differentiate from their competitors in the market and extend that curiosity to know which of those differentiators actually matter to their customer, they're destined for mediocrity, if not worse.
Yeah, and tech can sometimes even be their worst enemy there, right? Because they think their software, their hardware, their widget is better. And it is for a very small period of time. But then it gets copied or it gets made better or whatever it is. And now the next one's there. And then they're wondering why they're not getting traction anymore. They're not focused on outcomes, right? They're focused on pushing the product they have.
Yeah, many times we do engagements, and I'll go back to the steel drum industry because it's always an interesting story to tell, but they were out promoting and bragging and proudly, we use American steel, you can trace it back to the mill. We have ISO standards, we meet them, we're ISO certified, we meet ANSI standards in our production, we self-test. All of these things that are absolutely to be proud of, but they're table stakes. They're all the things, any drum company, if they want to make that product, they have to do that. Or they can't compete, they can't be in the market, their drums, DOT won't accept them, there's all that. So we got curious, well, what is the reason? You have customers that have been with you for 20 plus years and never stray. And we did a detailed, voice of customer conversation with the customers. What was the number one reason? They answered the phone. Number two, when we goof or we have a run on something, there's no other company flexible that cares about us enough to help us get it right away. Other guys are, so it was all, our curiosity proved that what the customers really cared about was the personal touch, the customer service, and the agility. Those were the differentiators that made them. And when the company then focused all of their marketing strategy and the brand message on that, the growth was exponential. I mean, it grew like crazy. So
yeah, there's a lot of organizations on the research side that have measured this. Challenger, Gartner, Forrester, a bunch of those.
Sure.
And all the data says the same thing, right? Your brand, your company name and reputation, right? It's important, but it's not going to generate loyalty the same way. Your product, services, and solutions are important, but they're not going to generate loyalty. And even the value you're creating versus the price you're charging, important, right? But not going to generate loyalty. So what they're really saying is this: those things are expected of you in business today. You got to have a company that people know are going to be around. You have to keep pushing the envelope on your technology, and you got to be competitive.
Yep.
But how you actually help me achieve my business outcomes becomes your differentiator.
Absolutely.
And we enable those things with products, right? We don't focus on products to get there. So that's the story that they need, and that requires a different level of curiosity. I've got to know business issues and market changes and implications of those things. And I have a perspective by seeing 100 customers that I can bring into a conversation with one that they just don't have. That's the curiosity at work.
So really the message is, if anyone can make a few sales, but if you truly want to create voracious advocates for your company's brand, you got to be curious enough to find out what it takes and to get them engaged.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So
one of the things I always ask, and some people like it, some people don't, the final, because we're running out of time here, is there a question that I didn't ask that I should have asked you that you'd like to share the answer to?
Yeah, the big one is this, is can I actually do something different in my business to help curiosity grow? And the answer is yes, right? That's what we work on with people all the time. We help their leaders not only understand what's important to allow curiosity to grow, but we help them create those environments inside their teams that allow them those things to actually flourish. Now, the good news is we can measure where they are today, and we can see the impact of that very quickly in the organization and within like a 6-month period of time. So we can pre and post measure it, and then the performance always follows it. But can you affect change? The answer is yes, but you got to be willing to create a different kind of environment to allow that to happen.
And I'm
now
so
with
glad.
it,
Oh, sorry. No, go
oh,
ahead.
sorry. Yeah, with it, you get other things too, right? You don't even get the results, but you get much more engagement, and people are more disengaged than they ever have been, right?
Yep.
So I get engagement, I get employee satisfaction, I get all of those things as an end result of it. But you got to start there first. That's the big thing.
Yeah, I got to say, I'm so glad after all these years we were able to re-engage.
Yeah, me too.
I'm so glad to see what great work you're doing. I'm fascinated by it, and I know we're gonna have many more conversations going forward. Tell folks how they can find you if they want to.
There's two different ways. One, if you want to jump out to our website, we post all of our publications there, and we do a lot of writing. So www.inquizo.com. Or if you want to reach out to me directly, Michael at inquizo.com as well. Feel free to reach out to me, ask your questions, and let's have a conversation about how we can help you get more curious as well.
That's fantastic. I hope people do get more curious and reach out to you. For everyone out there, please, if you enjoyed this conversation, consider subscribing to the podcast, the Fangoldcast. We'd love to have you engage with even more of the interesting folks coming forward. I think so far this is one of the most curious conversations, most interesting conversations we've had. I'm so glad you joined us today, Michael, and let's talk.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Brought to you by Fangold Technologies, where we help you convert every person your company touches into a voracious advocate for your brand.